This is step 6 of the transition from Embari to Cloudera Manager. This part we will be configuring the governance components. From here we're going to start with Ranger. We're going to go to the Ranger service. We're going to start. Now that the Ranger service has started, let's bring up the Ranger UI. As you can see, we have all of the same service repos that we had in Ranger from the Embari managed cluster. For this cluster, under CM control, we need to add in or have CM initialize the repos and link them to the services in this version. Let's bring up the Ranger UI. As you can see, this Ranger has service repos from our previous installation of the cluster managed under Embari. We need to go back into Cloudera Manager and initialize the new services for this Cloudera managed cluster. So go back to Cloudera Manager, go to Ranger Actions, and set up Ranger Plugin Service. Now that the setup of those plugin services has been completed, let's go back to the Ranger UI and see those new services. Refresh the interface, and now you can see I have new services for each one of those. CM_HDFS, HBase, Hadoop SQL. Note that the service is actually CM Hive, not Hadoop SQL. There's a difference between the display name, and one for each one of the services that we can put under control. At this point, I want to migrate entries from our old policies to the new policies. So if I go into the HDFS policy, you can see I only have 2 policies here, whereas I had an array of policies in my old HDFS policy service manager. To do that, I have an Ansible script that leverages a tool that we use, the Ranger migration services, that will migrate and upsert policies from one service to the other. We'll run that now. This migration process will work for when there are repos defined on each side. If there's not a repo or a repo is missing in the original source, then that part of the migration process will fail, which is expected. In this case, the intent is only to migrate and activate Ranger services that were there before the upgrade. In my case, I only was using Ranger services, Ranger plugin services for HDFS and Hive. Now the migration is complete for the service repos that mattered. Let's go back and check that that migration worked. If I go into the newly created CM HDFS, you can see all of my policies have been migrated over to that policy. Next part we want to do is go into the Ranger policy for HDFS, this all paths policy, and we want to make a modification to this policy and add the Hue user to this policy. The Hue user is treated as a super user in CM. You could probably restrict this some more if you wanted to, but for illustrative purposes, we're going to add it to the root policy here. It is used to do a lot of management from the CM console. So we're going to give it access to HDFS. And then we're going to create a policy for the infrasolar resource, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add a new policy for solar. This tag, and and add in a user. Give them full permissions to this directory resource. Save. There we go. And in the background, let's go ahead and create, ensure that that directory exists in HDFS. Oh, sorry, can't do that yet. Don't have HDFS up and running. Now that we've added the policies that we needed to open the cluster up, let's go to each service that I had activated Ranger plugins for on my old cluster and activate them again. In this case, I only will activate Ranger plugins for HDFS and Hive. And at this point, just before starting up the cluster, we're going to go ahead and activate Kerberos for this cluster, now that we have all of our configurations set before we start the service for the first time. I'm using Red Hat. Go ahead and do that. And then put in my Kerberos credentials. Now that Cloudera Manager has been able to successfully create a control account, we can go ahead and configure Kerberos for the cluster using the default principles. Once Kerberos has successfully deployed the client configurations and key tabs for all the services, it will go ahead and try to start the rest of the cluster. And since we have everything configured already, the rest of the cluster should come up, and it should be the only time that we should have to start or restart HDFS. The cluster has now been Kerberized and successfully started.